It's finally happening. Northern Powerhouse Rail is on.
I'm determined that this government, with me as Chancellor, will back that rhetoric with hard cash.
Rachel Reeves has finally committed to overhauling rail travel in the north of England. But will her multi-billion-pound gamble give her the growth she so desperately needs?
This investment is potentially the most growth-enhancing investment of anything they've announced since the general election. And it's been blown out of the water by their latest U-turn, this time on digital identity cards.
So has the Chancellor seized back the initiative, or has her announcement been lost in another mistake of the government's own making? Welcome to Talking Politics. Hello, I'm Tom Bradby. This is Talking Politics.
And I'm Robert Peston, and as you can see, I'm in a slightly, what should we say, sort of eccentric location. Believe it or not, I'm in a train repair yard in Leeds, and I'm sure anybody watching and listening will immediately know why I'll be in a train repair yard in Leeds. You want to guess, Tom?
Well, it's a quiz show. I mean, there we go. Is it something to do with Northern Powerhouse Rail by any remote chance?
That's why you are the top of your game presenter. You are. Yes, it's got everything to do with Northern Powerhouse Rail. It's because this is for reasons best known to the government, where the Chancellor wanted to do an interview with me. And ours is not to question the public relations, image building decisions of the government. So here I am, sitting in a stationary train, nonetheless with a lot of weird noise in the background, because apparently this is a good look for the government. What can I tell you?
Well, I'm about to go on and question the government's public relations strategy, because I've just listened to the interview you did, and full marks to you. Great effort on all front. You asked her about the U-turn on ID cards, the latest U-turn. You talked to her about Powerhouse Rail. You also talked to her about all those budget leaks before the budget. Let's just hear a clip of what she had to say about that.
I know you're absolutely furious by the leak of the change, the U-turn on income tax ahead of the budget. But equally, in the run-up, for weeks, the market conditioning was chaotic. It was unstable. It led to depressed business confidence, depressed consumer confidence. Growth was lower as a result. What lessons have you learned from what I would regard as, it was chaos in the run-up to the budget. What have you learned?
Well, if you look at the cost of government borrowing during the 12-week budget period, of course it moved around, but at the end and the beginning it was roughly the same. And in fact, since the budget, government borrowing costs have continued to fall, and the IMF...
You've got to accept that what not just the media but forecasters were expecting, and this was a result of Treasury signals, was just wrong.
No, I don't accept that at all, because what I said in my speech in early November was that everyone would have to make a contribution because of the challenges.
But so no lessons for the Treasury?
Well, and everyone is making a contribution by the freezing of the personal tax and national insurance.
I'm talking about your communications and the environment you created in the run-up to the budget. Really, were you happy with that degree of instability, that degree of misinformation?
Well, I very much deplore any leaking and any unauthorised leaking of budget information, and there was that during the budget. That's why we're having the leak inquiry. Of course, the most damaging leak was the leak of my budget about an hour and a half before the budget by the Office of Budget Responsibility, but they've taken responsibility for that. Their chair has resigned, and while I thank him for his substantial public service, it was right that he took responsibility.
Okay, well, what I would say about this interview, Robert, is it was a good interview. Rachel Reeves, to me, has always come across as a sort of basically likeable person. Now, lots of people listening to this who've been on the wrong side of decisions she's made, whether it's U-turns or budget decisions, might be throwing something at the TV or the radio or the phone, whatever they're listening on, and be very annoyed about that. And she has hacked off a lot of people, but she's always struck me as somebody who's trying to do the right thing and whose heart's potentially in the right place. But honestly, the strategy, like if you think back over the last year, I just can't understand it. And I didn't really understand this interview. Once again, she didn't really answer any questions. You know, you pushed her on the budget leak. She didn't hold up her hands and say, you know, she basically said that there was one big budget leak and it wasn't my fault. Somebody else has taken responsibility for that. She didn't talk at all about her attempts to kind of come out and effectively say, I'm going to break my manifesto promises, and then not actually saying she's going to break her manifesto promises and then not actually doing it. So I don't know. You did the interview. What was your impression of it?
So that was certainly the least, you know, she was at her sort of least impressive, shall we say, when I was talking to her about that extraordinary instability in the run-up to the budget. I mean, I've never known sort of communications chaos really like it, so like we saw in the 2.5 months, because broadly, all the messages from the Treasury over that period was there was this enormous black hole, and then, you know, right at the end they said, whoops, the black hole isn't quite as big as it was, and they claimed right at the end that this was all new news, that the black hole wasn't as big as it was, and then we subsequently discovered, thanks to a very cross Office for Budget Responsibility, that they'd known all along that the black hole wasn't as big as they had been sort of signalling. I'm afraid the consequence of this, I would say, mismanagement of the messaging is that in the run-up to the budget, confidence of businesses, I said this to the Chancellor in this interview, confidence of businesses, confidence of consumers was hurt. And we saw in statistics that have already come out that as a result of that bloated confidence, the growth of the UK economy, already very, very low, became non-existent. Because, you know, shoppers stopped spending and businesses stopped investing. So there was a cost, but she just would not. I mean, I just said to her, which, you know, I thought was a perfectly reasonable question that she'd engage with, you know, you must have learned some lessons from this chaos. What are they? But she just wouldn't, you know, she just wouldn't engage with any of this, which, you know, was a sort of, I mean, is the right word disappointment? I was surprised, certainly. But, you know, on the other side of things, she's plainly had a good Christmas break. She's much more buoyant and relaxed than I've seen her in a while. But the other thing that was just sort of, I mean, just mind-boggling for me over the last 24 hours, this investment in transport in the north, the belated beginning of the work to put in place Northern Powerhouse Rail. And you, like me, have been around this place for long enough, we're old enough to remember that it was in 2014 that George Osborne, as Chancellor, first announced that we would be getting this Northern Powerhouse Rail. And we've seen literally no start, no investment, nothing since then. Well, she's done it today. It is, in my view, a good news story. This investment, I mean, you know, my criticism is they're not doing it fast enough, but nonetheless, this investment is potentially the most growth-enhancing investment of anything they've announced since the general election. It is, you know, basically, Tom, a good news story, and it has been blown out of the water by their latest U-turn, this time on digital identity cards. You know, again, you know, one of the things I put to her, as you know, will have heard, was, why is it, you know, whenever you try and get on the front foot, something else goes wrong and you have to do another U-turn and nobody notices any of, you know, as I say, arguably the positive stuff you're doing?
Well, let's deal with that, because we've talked a fair bit about digital ID cards. You know, part of the reason they were theoretically going to do it was because the French, you know, President Macron is always arguing, look, it's all very well you complaining about people crossing in small boats. Not having digital ID cards is part of the pull factor. It's why people come here, because it's easier to work on the black market. This was supposed to address that. Rachel Reeves sort of slightly dodged the question and said, well, there's 100 ways this can work. You know, maybe we're not having digital ID cards, but, you know, the answers we're coming up with can work just as well. So once again, before we get on to talking about kind of U-turns generally, what do you make of where they actually are on it?
Look, where they are in terms of the new position, I stress this is a new position, is perfectly rational, right? I mean, what Macron said was he wanted the so-called pull factor for migrants coming across the channel to be reduced, and his argument, which Keir Starmer accepted, and I was at the sort of press conference where Macron made this crystal clear just a few months ago. He said reduce the pull factor, and it's completely because his point was it is too easy for people to work illegally in the UK. Starmer accepted that, and what the Chancellor told me today is the new government position should still make it much, much harder for for people to work illegally here, because what she said is it's not just the new digital ID card that will be qualification for work, but if you've got a passport, you can show that. If you've got an electronic visa, you can show that. It's a completely rational position that they've taken. So maybe this new plan will reduce the sort of incentive for people to risk their lives coming across the channel as asylum seekers. But, and this is the important point, right? The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, that was not what he announced in the autumn. What he announced in the autumn was that the only check that would be accepted would be this digital ID card. And basically, there was no ambiguity about it. I mean, his words are absolutely clear. So we should be in no doubt, Tom, this is a big shift. And in that sort of ghastly terminology that those of us in the media always use, it is another U-turn.
You asked her whether she'd be in place, or you actually asked it in quite a clever way by saying the Prime Minister says you'll be in place as long as he is. So will you be in place? Which made me laugh and just about got a smile out of her. My guess is she will be in place because I think he'll be in place. Of course, it's possible he's booted out after the local elections this year or for any other time for any other reason. I still think, on balance, as we've discussed many times before, you and I have lived through many potential Labour coups. There were a lot of them under Gordon Brown. Most of them only lasted 5 minutes. The Labour Party doesn't have a very strong track record of getting rid of its leaders. Maybe this will be the exception, and they will, but I wouldn't bet my house on it. So I think it's perfectly plausible that we're with the same leadership this time next year. You made the point that she looked like she'd had a rest and she was quite chipper. That was actually my takeaway from the interview. She looked quite chipper and was quite confident and looked to be confident in her position and all the rest of it. I still don't, and I know we've been talking about this for weeks and weeks and weeks, I still don't really see the point of and there's a couple of substantial points that you talked about, which I would like to address in a minute. Just before we do, I still don't see the point of coming to sit down. You're political editor of ITV. You have enormous influence. I've always felt you're very fair. You have your take on things. You give that take. It's not always positive to the government or negative. You judge each issue as it comes. Here's a moment to sit down with you and have an honest conversation about what's been going on, about your commentary on it, about where she thinks you've got it right, about where she thinks you've got it wrong, about where you may have a point. But they never do any of that. They just don't answer the question 27 ways. And I can't understand what the point of that communication strategy is. And am I missing something?
No, you're not. I mean, you'd have thought, whether it's Starmer or whether it's the Chancellor, you might recognise that it hasn't been going terribly well, and actually your best bet in terms of getting the public on your side is to just be a bit more yourself and admit when things haven't gone wrong, and as I say, engage with, we messed that up and this is how we're going to do things differently. But for whatever reason, they can't unlearn, decades within political parties of never essentially being confident enough to admit mistakes. In terms of her own personal position, I think it is pretty secure. The Prime Minister did say on the record, very publicly, she was going to be in place until the general election. He said this last year. And, that broadly means, that's why I asked the question the way I did, that she survives for as long as he survives. I mean, I do agree with you, Tom, that I think the likelihood is, even if, these elections in May are an absolute catastrophe for the government, and I think there's a fair amount of evidence in the elections for the Parliament in Scotland and the Assembly in Wales are going to be an absolute catastrophe for the government. But I think he survives partly because the only candidate, obviously no candidates have declared, but the ones we expect, the only candidate who actually has a significantly different agenda from the Starmer-Reeves one is Andy Burnham. It's much more to the left of them, and Andy Burnham doesn't even have a seat in Parliament, right? But the other candidates, what is their pitch? Whether it's Shavana Mahmood or Wes Streeting, again, none of them declared, but they're the ones who are widely seen, correctly in my view, as the most ambitious who would love at some point to succeed Starmer. But broadly, their messages are, we're just better communicators than Starmer, which isn't. I don't think. Do you think that's a compelling offer to MPs and members if they're going to change, do the sort of really bold thing of throwing out a leader and looking a lot like the last Tory government? I mean,
not compelling enough. I would.
What
say,
do you think?
No, I don't think that's compelling enough. When you spend time at Westminster, which we both have over the years, one of the striking things is how insular it gets at times, and you feel like people are listening to themselves and talking to their, nearest and dearest colleagues, and not actually really listening to real people. And again, we've talked about this a lot on the podcast, so I won't go on about it too much. But it's just every time you go out there beyond the Westminster bubble, people are like, I voted for these guys. I just want them to get on with it. So I think the idea that they go back to the public and say, yeah, we've changed our leader, but everything's going to be different. I just think that will so annoy people. I'm not saying Labour's in a good position. I'm not saying that they're going to win the next election. They're a long, long way from both of those things. But I think the worst thing they could do is change their leader and then have to go back to people and saying, oh, yeah, he was no good, but this one's great. I just think after everything we saw with the Tories, that will wind people up so much there will actually be no way back from Labour. I need to let you get on a real train and get
Can I ask you before we wind up? Can I just ask you a question? Right.
Go on.
Because this is sort of slightly on my mind, right? So, in the last, literally just 3 weeks, right, we've seen a big climb down on the inheritance tax that farmers have to pay. We've seen a big U-turn on the business rates that, well, at least one narrow sector of the high street that's going to be hurt by these rises in business rates, which is pubs. Actually, one of the things I was staggered by, actually, when I was talking to the Chancellor just now, is, she made it clear the relief that she's going to give is only for pubs, but restaurants are going to fail, hotels are going to fail, bookshops are going to fail as a result of rates going up. So whether this position of just supporting pubs is going to be sustainable, we haven't got the detail of it yet. We will have to see. And then, as I say, we have seen this massive volte-face on digital ID. They're still going to develop the digital ID, but it's not remotely going to be compulsory. And given that they frankly, there is a very good case in my view for digital ID cards. They've just been absolutely useless at making that case. But I suppose the question I want to ask you is this. They are doing these U-turns now faster and faster. The farm one took well over a year, right? But, the business rates one, took a few weeks. Digital ID one took a few weeks. Can I just ask, do you think out there in the among voters, they see these U-turns as, manifestation of incompetence? Or do you think they see them as sort of, oh, well, you can't get everything right, and, maybe the government is sort of listening and adapting and not digging in? Because there is an argument for saying, if you're gonna make changes, do them fast. And there is an argument for saying, if you think you've got it wrong, just change it and change it fast. Do you think this stuff ultimately is damaging? Because they did dig in on a lot of things for ages, like, for example, the winter fuel payment, and that was disastrous. So do you think at the very least doing your U-turns quicker is a good thing for them?
Unhelpfully, I think both things are true. I think if you're going to do a U-turn and you've got an unpopular policy, then it's better to do it quickly. I think your communication strategy is key, and theirs is hopeless. So you need to come out and say, yeah, really sorry, we got that wrong. Here was our intention, but it was the wrong decision. Really apologise. We'll think more carefully next time, which they never quite do. It's better to do it because the policy itself is dragging them down. So they've got to do it, and they've got to do it quickly, and they'd be much better off to apologise and admit they've got stuff wrong. But the first part of your point, the first part of your question was, do I think people out there are thinking they're incompetent? And unfortunately, the number of U-turns is leading to a colossal sense of incompetence. But much more important, and we've discussed this so often, what's this government for? I couldn't tell you, and it's my job to know. I'm not sure, maybe you can tell me. It doesn't seem to have a compelling narrative or a uniting theme. And the one thing, I often think back to Tony Blair, and you think back to the invasion of Iraq, and it was a policy that the majority of the country in the end didn't agree with, or a huge number, many millions of people didn't agree with. And he went out making the argument over and over and over again, and he was back in the wrong policy because I don't think he was ever going to convince people. But the one thing Blair was absolutely brilliant at is he'd take a position and then he'd go and look people in the eye and say, beat me up if you want, but here's why I think this is the right decision. And this I can't think of anything this government has done where they've kind of gone and said, beat me up if you want, but we have to do this for the following reasons. They just can't seem to stick to anything.
So I'm going to tell you there is one thing, Dave. So you are right that they're all over the shop in terms of the perceptions of what their priorities are. The latest one out of what's called political cabinet, which is when the cabinet meets in a sort of party political framework rather than as the government of the country. This happened last week. Is the new priority is the cost of living, and let's talk about what that means on another podcast. But it's not the same as their previous priority, which was growth. They've had so many blooming priorities. It's not surprising that people are a bit confused. But actually, and actually, on one of the things they got massively wrong on digital ID, there is a case for digital ID. But if you're going to do digital ID, you make the argument in speeches, in interviews for weeks and months before you announce the policy. This policy was announced literally out of a clear blue sky. Nobody was expecting it. And it turns out they hadn't thought it through properly, hence the U-turn. That is not the way to do effective politics, to be clear. But there is one policy which Keir Starmer has made the argument for time and time again, and that is not being rude to Donald Trump, not standing up to Donald Trump. It is the one thing that he has been, and it's consistent with. And let's be absolutely clear, I do not believe it's remotely popular with the British people, but you've got to give him his credit, whether you like it or not. That is what he's argued consistently, and he has stuck to it.
You probably can't see that I'm laughing a lot at that. Look, I need to let you get on a real train and come south, but I do have to ask you about one thing, which I think is a really interesting issue that's come to the fore, and I really want to hear what you've got to say about it before we wind up. Immigration is falling. The rate of immigration is falling really pretty drastically to where we may end up this year, which is sort of much, much lower levels. That has led to speculation that because we have, as per our many previous discussions, an economy that's where growth is very predicated on continuing immigration, and there's a whole debate about whether we need to have a different kind of economy, but let's not have that. That is a subject for a future podcast. But just in mathematical terms, there are some people saying if immigration falls as far as some people are suggesting it will, she's going to have another black hole and she's going to have to put up taxes again. What do you make of that?
All right, that is just basic maths, okay? And that is a risk for her. There was, actually, I thought, quite a good news story in the interview that she gave me, because when I put that to the Chancellor, what she said, and actually, I've been talking to other members of the cabinet, this is definitely happening. Whether it happens with the numbers that they want, the numbers that would mean that the tax revenues wouldn't fall, we shall see. But she said that she is able to offset the fall in general immigration because she is now making a big priority of getting highly skilled talent into the country, the kind of people who get paid hundreds of thousands of pounds because of their technical skills, their scientific skills, and all the rest of it. And she actually said, in terms, she wants considerably more of those very talented people to come to the UK. Now, as I say, there is an issue around whether or not she'll get enough in, on big incomes to offset the fall in tax just from the hundreds of thousands who've been coming in to do the much more basic jobs. But that, I have to say, is quite a bold thing to be doing, actually. Immigration of all sorts is not popular. It is, many would say, highly rational, particularly when you've got so many really exciting young, small, high-tech businesses as we have in this country. And you've got, very talented people being very nervous about going to Trump's America. I personally think this is economically a very rational thing to do, to try and welcome particularly, these very highly skilled people to the UK. So that is her answer to that challenge. Whether she can get enough of them to offset the tax squeeze, we shall see.
Interesting. Okay, that's it for now. Robert and I will be back next week for more Talking Politics. If you haven't already subscribed on YouTube or on any podcast platform, please make sure you do so you don't miss out an episode. Thanks for joining us, and therefore it is goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.